Hello and welcome to the Indoor Environment Show. I'm Bob Krell, founder and publisher of Healthy Indoors magazine, and as always, joined by my co-host Don Weeks, who is the president of the Indoor Environmental Quality Global Alliance, IEQGA. Hey Don, how are you?
Hi, how you doing today?
Very good. We're closing in on the holiday season. I don't know. Apparently, we're going to receive some of your Arctic air down here in Syracuse later in the week. Is it
Oh,
cold
lucky
in
you.
Is it cold in Ottawa right now?
It is cold, but we had 2 feet of snow over the weekend, so that was
Ah,
more the event that we had. So we're doing good now. Though we're getting back up and running.
excellent, excellent. Well, we have snow right now, so I mean, of course, we're the snowiest city in the United States typically, so no surprise there.
That's true.
Anyway, so great show today. I'm
Yeah,
excited for this one. I love the topic. So I
sounds
guess
good.
without further ado, well, oh no, further ado. First, I want to mention that this program is a collaboration between the International Society of Indoor Air Quality and Climate (ISIAC) and the Indoor Environmental Quality Global Alliance (IEQGA). So they are the sponsoring organizations, and Healthy Indoors magazine. We are the production company. There we go.
Sounds good. All right, well then let's bring our guest in, and I'll do the introductions. Hello, welcome to Ula and to Dushan. And let me give Ula the first introduction. She's been involved with indoor environmental quality and healthy buildings for 25 years of experience, and she's a visiting professor, senior research associate at the University of Tulsa since 2006, and a professor at the University of Urdu since 2020. Her research has focused on collecting and analyzing empirical data and developing methods to assess dampness and mold, ventilation adequacy, thermal conditions, and cleanliness in homes and schools, as well as both self-reported and objective standardized health and learning outcomes. She has coordinated several studies on assessing the impact of energy retrofits on indoor environmental quality and occupant well-being. Recently, she is developing an master's program in healthy buildings and supervising 6 PhD students in the field. Ula also serves on the ISIAC board, or served on the ISIAC board of directors from 2016 to 2020, and she's currently leading the ISIAC STC 34 that is developing indoor environmental guidelines. Hello, Ula. How are you?
Hello, good, good. Thanks for having me, and thank you for the introduction.
Yeah, and now I'll introduce your colleague, Dushan Lucena is an assistant professor at the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, EPFL, and serves as director of the Human-Oriented Building Environmental Laboratory. He conducts fundamental and applied research in the field of sustainable and healthy built environment, with a specific focus on indoor and air pollutants dynamics, exposure science, and building ventilation. Dusan holds a master's and bachelor degrees in mechanical engineer from the University of Belgrade. Completed his joint doctorate degree at the National University of Singapore and Technical University of Denmark, followed by a postdoctoral appointment at the University of California, Berkeley. Prior to joining EPFL, he also served as the director of standard development team at the International Well Building Institute. Dusan is an active member of the boards of various scientific and professional groups, where he examines the future of buildings with an aim to ensure high indoor environmental quality for occupants with minimum energy use. So welcome, Dusan. How are you today?
I'm fine, thanks. And I really like the way you pronounce EPFL in French. So, good job.
Yeah, I was impressed that he actually pulled that off, because as he started to go there, I was like,
Well, as you know, well, at least Bob knows, and I think Ula does as well, is that I'm married to somebody who's a francophone from Quebec. So I have a little bit of a head start on that one. Well, let's start with Ula first. As I mentioned in your introduction, you have a doctorate in scientific technology from Tampere University of Technology, TUT, civil engineering, and a master's degree from TUT, civil engineering. So how did you become interested in indoor air quality?
So yeah, maybe it was like a coincidence, because when I was studying during my undergraduate studies, my sister was studying medicine at the same time, and that led to some discussion between us about the possibility to combine building and health sciences, and that then led me to start studying environmental health as a minor subject. And I found a summer job in the field under Aino Nevalainen's group. That was the time when dampness and mold issues were really constantly present in the media in Finland, and my summer job and then later on my master thesis dealt with that topic, and I just continued that path towards doctoral degree under Aino's supervision.
Yeah, so basically it relates back to what you were seeing other researchers doing, and what you wanted to do was something similar to that. I imagine 25 years ago, it was still a relatively new topic back then.
Yes, it really was, and we didn't have any programs ready for that combination of civil engineering and indoor quality and health. So, but that started at that time, and now we are much further developed in that area. We can offer our students programs that are specifically designed for this type of field.
Great. And Dusan, you have a bachelor's and master's degree, as I mentioned, in mechanical engineering from the University of Belgrade in Serbia, and a joint PhD in civil environmental engineering from the National University of Singapore and the Technical University of Denmark, and a postgrad doc from the University of California, Berkeley. So how did you become interested in indoor air quality?
Yeah, well, growing up in Belgrade, which is capital of Serbia, it's kind of hard not to be aware of air quality issues, both outdoors and indoors. Belgrade is one of the most polluted cities in the world in the winter time, and also indoors a lot of people smoke. So I was sort of always aware of the air pollutant issues, but I never actually expected I'm going to end up working in this field. So because I have a background in mechanical engineering and HVAC system, which is very sort of system-oriented approach. But then when I moved to Singapore and started my joint degree in Singapore and Denmark, I really got interested. I got introduced to the field, met many experts, and there you go.
So both of those colleges or universities, I should say, in Singapore and Denmark have been in the indoor air quality research areas for many, many years. Who is it that you would say would be one of your main influences? Some of the professors are, I know actually from previous meetings. Which professor or professors have really kind of gave you a boost in that area?
Yeah, that's a great question. In Singapore, I worked with the Tam Kwok Wai and Chandra Shekhar, who got me introduced to the field. In Denmark, I worked with Arsen Malikov, which was also great inspiration. And probably the biggest inspiration was Bill Nazaroff. You probably know of him from University of California, Berkeley.
Yes, I do. Yeah. So you're doing work with him at the University of California, Berkeley at the moment?
No, that was kind of 5 years ago, and now I started my own lab in Switzerland. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you about. So the Switzerland lab, I will not try to pronounce it again, but EPFL, you're the assistant professor and head of human-oriented building environmental labs at the School of Architecture or Civil and Environmental Engineering. So what can you tell us about your current research on sustainable healthy buildings, with a primary focus on pollutant dynamics in relation to occupant exposures, building ventilation and controls?
So just to say, EPFL stands for, when you translate it, Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Lausanne. Anyway, so yeah, since 2018, I founded a new lab. Currently, we have 12 members. We're still in a growth phase, and pretty much each member is working on a different but related project. And as a lab, our overall vision is to explore intersections between people and buildings by ensuring good air quality with minimum energy use, or at least without compromising energy use. So a couple of projects we have at the moment are more applied in collaboration with industry, and that more relates to indoor air quality sensing, ventilation controls. But majority of the projects that we run are linked to fundamental air quality research, to linked to air pollutant dynamics and exposure, inhalation exposure assessment. So, for example, at the moment, we have interesting project. We are trying to understand how human presence and activities in indoor environments, they influence particle burden and chemistry and microbial burden of indoor air. We look into different variables such as physical activity, cognitive engagement, use of personal care products, and so on. And we're also looking into importance of human skin, clothing, and breath on the inhalation exposure. These are some of the interesting things we work at the moment.
So I just want to jump in on that one.
Sure.
So with your research since the COVID pandemic, in the last couple of years, has that's been some of the focus then, right? When you're looking at the inhalation and the exhalation from the occupants in the space, is that part of what you look at, or not necessarily? That was
not necessarily. We're more interested in not kind of risk of infection spread. Of course, this is also like very much linked to our project, but it was not our main focus of study.
Okay. And I'm familiar with some of your research, particularly with regards to schools and indoor air quality. You're a professor, obviously, at the University of Oulu in Finland, as well as a visiting professor at the University of Tulsa. Can you give us some idea of what your current research, what are you doing some research on at the moment?
So I started participating research in the US during my postdoctoral years over 20 years ago, and have continued that until now. And these have been mainly studies related to school buildings, and also related to we've done some home intervention studies. And but during this time, at the same time, I have been also continued working in Finland, first with the National Institute for Health and Welfare, and then since 2020 I started to work at the Oulu University, where I'm currently leading a research group of also about 12 persons. We are increasing, developing a young group. We have about 5 ongoing research projects on various topics, and one specifically is on the effects of energy retrofits on indoor environmental quality and health in a wider scope of climate change. So it's in sort of balancing risks and benefits related to energy efficiency, and that's one of the main topics for us today to discuss. So.
Yeah, I mean, and that is a big topic, obviously, in particular in Europe right now, with the shut off of the natural gas and other products from Russia. So the study that you're doing obviously predates that, I would think, and it's looking at the energy retrofits in buildings. Are you looking specifically in housing, or is it other buildings like schools or things of that nature?
We have been mainly focused on housing and especially multifamily buildings, but we also have done some case studies in schools and other building types, and looking to also expand that in the future.
And what have you published any of your studies, recent ones?
Yes, so we started the study on effects of energy retrofits back in 2005, and we did the first study during 2010, 2015, where we followed up. We did measurements pre and post retrofitting buildings, but it was a short-term follow-up. It was only about 1 year after retrofits when we did the post-retrofit measurements. And now we are continuing that, and we are in fact following these same homes about 10 years after the retrofits, and we are trying to confirm that the effects that we saw during the first study remain similar, or because there is a possibility that we see some effects that wouldn't last.
But have you seen some effects that have lasted over that period of time? You did the initial study in 2010. It's been 12 years since then. What are you finding now?
Well, we just collected the data last spring and we are currently analyzing that, so we don't have anything final yet. But in fact, like the indoor environment conditions in these homes seem to be surprisingly similar now than they were 10 years ago. So it seems like the effects are more in the long-term nature. And of course, we saw many positive effects in occupant health and well-being based on their self-reported health. And we haven't analyzed those data yet, but hopefully we see similar trends so we can really say that we can get go benefits from improved energy retrofits. But there are some risks as well that we saw, especially in certain building types where there weren't adequate ventilation. So that has to be sort of taken into account.
That's always, that's always been a kind of a balancing act, right? In for trying to manage buildings. Though, as long as I've been in the industry, actually way predating that in the early '70s, where it always seems like there's always, in my mind, there's always been a compromise between energy efficiency, right? Having good building performance versus indoor air quality. And it was always like, well, you have to sacrifice one for the other, and what I'm getting from both of you is that this is no longer going to be an acceptable paradigm, right? We're dealing with sustainability issues and climate change, and we obviously have to affect how we do energy usage with our building stock. But indoor air quality is becoming even, I think, more of a keen focus, right? Especially now in light of the last couple of years with the pandemic, right?
Right. We can't accept like reduction of the indoor environmental quality when doing these retrofits, but there is a great potential. We have seen over 50% like energy consumption reduction after these retrofits. It depends on the starting point, of course. If the starting point is low energy efficient building, you can really see large potential for energy saving, but it's by increasing insulation and air tightness of the building envelope. So that then creates the possibility of ventilation rate decreasing. So we have to ensure that there is adequate ventilation that is not compromising the air quality.
And Dushan, as sort of a follow-up to that, what can you tell me about energy policies for building retrofits and new construction? How does it impact indoor environments?
Well, at least in Europe, but I would also say globally, energy policies are predominantly focused on reduction of heating losses, really, and probably now during energy crisis in Europe, this is the case more than ever. But there are, I think, quite a lot of studies that clearly show that these retrofitting strategy, which singularly focus on energy conservation, that they can easily result in a worsening indoor environment. So the most common and most studied example is addition of thermal insulation, which of course leads to reduced air leakage. But if this is not sufficiently compensated for proper ventilation, it results in increased contaminant concentration. But at the same time, now in Europe, we're facing more and more heat waves. So adding thermal insulation can also contribute to overheating in a summer months. So yeah, these are just some examples that singular focus on energy could result in compromised air quality and indoor environment. So this is something I believe that energy renovation policies should take into account.
And in Europe, mostly, am I correct in assuming that there's not the use of air conditioning that much in the residential environment in a lot of the climate zones in Europe? Whereas in the United States, we're seeing more and more residential air conditioning. Obviously, commercial buildings all have it. Here, mostly, we're very rarely naturally ventilated. But that's an issue, right? I mean, obviously, if you're dealing with raising temperatures.
That is correct. Relatively speaking, Europe is using almost non-air conditioning units compared to the States. However, I believe SIPSI has predicted that the cooling demand will increase by several times by 2050, and this will, of course, be reflected in increased sale of the AC units unless we do something about it. Last years in Switzerland, we really have heat waves during the summer time, and there is actually official statistics showing that the sale of the AC units has been increasing. I don't know about the rest of the Europe, but I would say that Switzerland is rather representative.
And that puts a
Yes,
substantial.
even-
Well,
Sorry.
hopefully it's talking at once. Great. Why don't we go with Lula? What were you
That
going
happens.
to say, Lula?
Yes, even in Finland, like traditionally, we haven't used air conditioning because the actual need has been maybe 2 weeks maximum during the summer. But at the same time, also the occupant requirement level has increased, and now there is, like you can clearly see the trend of more heat pumps being installed and even air conditioning systems in Finnish buildings as well. And we have seen this overheating possibility also during the winter if for example, after retrofitting, if the heating system is not adjusted to the level of the new construction. So there is a great potential actually for energy saving and better indoor and water quality by just adjusting the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, and not to waste the energy too much by heating and cooling and then overcompensating it by opening windows, for example, and so on.
Bob?
Well, what I was going to say is, Dusan, you mentioned how I anticipate you says a double or a triple usage in air conditioning in the residential sectors in the coming decade or so. I'm paraphrasing that terribly, but if that is the case, that's going to be a substantial draw on the energy grid during the cooling months, right, during the summer, because that air conditioning equipment uses an awful heavy electrical load typically.
Yes. So if we purely rely on the mechanical systems, I don't think we will be able to really make it to the climate goals. And in addition to that, there is some other research showing that people are in a way becoming addicted to cooling. We are more and more dependent on this very narrow deadband range of indoor temperature set points. Whereas in the past, we used to be able to tolerate much wider range of temperatures. So this is also interesting kind of psychological aspect to think about along.
So before I forget, the SIPSI stands for, what is that? What are the initials?
Yeah, that's the UK organization that produces various standards and guidelines for ventilation and thermal comfort in the UK. And I cannot exactly now tell you what's the abbreviation.
That's fine, but if you don't mind, it would be appreciated if you would tell us after the show what the report that you were mentioning, where people can get that report, because I think it would be of interest in that regard.
Absolutely. All
right, so what we had mentioned it just briefly just a minute ago, but as Bob had mentioned, since the late 70s or thereabouts, there's been this question about whether energy and indoor environmental quality are indeed in conflict or not. And what are the strategies we can think of to jointly tackle both energy and indoor air quality and thermal comfort? And I'll start with Dusan, if you could start on that one.
Yeah, I'd say that a lot of building stakeholders do believe that focus on indoor environmental quality will certainly be associated with additional energy investment. And I've already given some examples about, if we do reduce ventilation rates to save the energy, right, that will result in higher pollutant concentration in the air. That's a typical example. And this kind of view does certainly lead to a notion that indoor environment or indoor air quality goals and energy goals are in conflict. But I think that situation is more complex than that, because there are many energy efficient strategies that could degrade indoor air quality, but also there are many strategies that can jointly tackle IAQ and energy goals, or at least if we focus on one, we do not compromise the other one. This is what I've been also teaching my students at EPFL. And when we think about the strategies that can jointly tackle both indoor environment and energy targets, I think what is very important is to think hierarchically. We cannot simply, put the most energy efficient AC unit. This is not really a way to go. We need to really start from very, source control or load reduction in the first place, before we move on to passive strategies. And then we can end with the active strategies, and we can talk about energy efficient active system and so on. So I think in practice, very often we are not following this hierarchy, which is in a way causing problems. So we need to include also more architects into equation, not only building service engineers, to kind of resolve the issue. And there are many examples we can think about. For example, good maintenance, commissioning, recommissioning of the building. We know that it's important that the design of the building is maintained throughout the life cycle of the building. And we have a good evidence that proper commissioning of the building systems can provide substantial energy saving, and also it can benefit the indoor environment. But in addition to that, there are many other examples. We can rely much more on natural or hybrid ventilation. We can better operate our windows with some low-cost intelligent systems. Often we're over-filtering the air. In fact, we're filtering much more than what we need in many parts of the world. And I think also air distribution in mechanical systems is not sufficiently utilized. These are kind of some examples from top of my head that we should focus on much more in order to really tackle these goals together.
Certainly reducing the load is like paramount, right? I mean, that's and in the United States, I can speak to this country, until recently, in the last several years, the effort was always to to add all these add-ons, air sealing, which there's a lot of value obviously in all of that building envelope work and the insulation work. But the focus was never on really reduction in the first place. And it was always like, well, we can have more efficient equipment. Well, that's great. You should have that. But, primary thing is the usage, I think. And so, I mean, do you see that there has been a paradigm shift on this, where that's becoming more of the standard practice to tackle that load issue first before even worrying about the technology so much?
Yeah, it's a good question. On the research side, I think people are becoming more aware, but in practice it's hard to tell. I'm not exposed to like practice every day, but yeah, I just think that this is the only way. I mean, to really do the thing in a right way.
So Ua, as a follow-up to that, do you see conditions in well, you get to see conditions both in the US and in Finland. Are you seeing a change in that attitude about indoor environmental quality and energy efficiency, or are they pretty much still an emphasis on the conflict between the two?
Well, I think there's a lot of discussion about this, but perhaps like among the researchers more, as Dusan indicated, and it's not really gotten into the practice yet to the great extent. But I really agree with Dusan's like hierarchy, and I think that's the key, is that we do everything we can using passive means, and then to the active ways of controlling when needed. And perhaps to add to that, one important component is just the good quality of construction to begin with, and that is causing major issues also now with the energy crisis in Europe, because because some of the buildings are in such poor quality that they just can't be in this type of. They need a lot of metered energy to stay warm, and it hits people, this type of energy poverty, really hard, certain groups of population, and that would be something that should be tackled more.
I would think so.
But that's
Bob.
absolutely true in the United States too. I mean, we really there's a major disparity, right, in socioeconomic levels on on how efficient buildings run. Some of the least efficient buildings with the worst indoor environmental quality issues are obviously in the underserved minority communities in this country, and really our construction in the United States even now still isn't fabulous. When you see new construction, especially in the residential sector and the multifamily sector, stuff isn't. We have the knowledge. We know how to seal buildings. We know how to design a good building envelope. We do know how to do all this stuff. But in actual practice, you still see buildings improperly flashed, water issues, leakage issues that could be avoided. And how do we change that? I guess is the question. I'm just posing it to everybody.
So, Ulla, in schools, are you seeing a change in in the United States in particular, but also here in Canada where I am, there's been an emphasis on schools and indoor environmental quality due to the pandemic. There's been use of various types of devices measuring CO2 and also some air cleaners that have come in and the districts, the school districts buy these by the thousand and put them in various classrooms. Are you seeing that changing the way in which research can be conducted, since there's been so many new things that have been added to schools, particularly regarding indoor air quality?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have actually one ongoing follow-up study that has been going on for 6 years that we started, where we started looking at the effects of like renovation, large-scale renovation, where the goal was to really improve the ventilation, for example, up above the current standards, and to be able to measure the benefits. And then COVID came, and I don't know if the data will be comparable to the situation before that. So we still haven't really started looking at that yet, but I'm expecting to see some really modifying and confounding effects of schools adding all those air cleaners and different practices. So that has been really the pandemic situation has really changed the school operations, and now we can see that it's been taken much more seriously, the need to ventilate and hygiene and other things.
Yes,
I've seen a lot of new research coming in, and we also are doing some, but it takes time to get published and all that. So
that's for sure. But one of the things I'm seeing is the pandemic kind of accelerated that whole research practice in some ways, not always. But there was these publication articles that came out in various publications about various aspects of this whole pandemic situation, and there was an emphasis on schools because there was whether or not schools can reopen under the current conditions. And you probably seen some of these preprint articles that have been coming out about some of that.
Yes, it's such an important thing that the schools stay open for the children and also for their parents to be able to work. So it's been getting a lot of attention, and they have been really interesting studies. We started studies in schools about 20 something years ago, and we were able to see that, for example, adequate ventilation in school associates with academic performance and health outcomes. But now there has been much more research published on especially the link between ventilation and health, and we have been seeing these estimates on how much per liter per second you can expect to see improvement in attendance, for example. And that's really important information for the decision makers, so that they can, it works as an incentive to improve the schools, and that's what has been lacking in the past. So,
But a lot of what happened in practice though during COVID, because improving ventilation usually involves major mechanical, retrofits and things that weren't feasible. So they were always looking for the real fast solution, right? We had to reopen schools, and it wasn't so much air changes, it was air cycles through filtration devices is really what happened. Which, and if it's predominantly filtration devices and it's not gas phase filtration, the only thing you're really addressing is particulate, which is fine for aerosolized bioaerosol particles you're trying to get, but doesn't solve general indoor air quality problems with off gassing and all the other issues that happen. Elevated CO2, you're not fixing that by putting portable air cleaners in rooms. So have we really fixed indoor air quality, or was the focus really just on one aspect, aerosolized particles?
Yeah, there is a little gap between what has been done before and suggested that health, looking at from some point of view, 4 liters per second per person ventilation rate would be optimal. And that was before COVID. And now we have seen these new studies that are suggesting much, much higher ventilation rates based on the spread of infection. So I think we still need to do a lot of work, and so that we can develop some guidelines related to these things. It's just now we have these two very distinct sort of opinions, or
yeah, they do seem to be opinions. They do seem to be more based on opinions than on actual numbers, research, in many ways. There's a Lancet article that I'm sure both of you are familiar with that came out just recently talking about increased ventilation as much as 25% above what the ASHRAE 62.2 levels are. And it's signed and written by a number of very prominent professors, but I'm not sure there's a relationship necessarily between increasing it by 25% and improved indoor air quality. Which brings me back to go ahead, Bob.
I was going to say that, which in turn, 25% increased ventilation would be a horrific energy penalty, unless you really come up with modified equipment that's so much more energy efficient to utilize that for that.
I like talking to mechanical engineers. Go ahead, Ulla. Go ahead.
Yeah, but does it have to be like that all the time, or can it be somehow based on the risk?
Yeah, that's what we haven't been able to determine yet, have we? And it's an issue. And which brings me back to something that you said, Dusan, you had said something about overfiltration, and I wanted to make sure that we got a full understanding of what you mean by that. What is exactly would you say would be too much filtration? What are you looking at?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I have a student that is looking into that topic. So it turns out that we are often over filtering, or sometimes also under filtering the air, because we don't really properly assess the building site, urban typology, and outdoor air quality in immediate surroundings of the building. If you look into ASHRAE 62.1 standard, the procedures for determining outdoor air quality, it's based on some EPA compliance, the very remote air quality stations, which are not actually representative of the air quality around the building. So this kind of calls for really more knowledge and more attention to understanding the actual environment in the building surroundings, and designing with the right filter, because over filtering the air has a huge energy penalty, but also we might be removing from the air something which might actually be beneficial from us.
So, I mean, you're suggesting like the need for maybe even real-time, both indoor and outdoor monitoring for particulates and chemicals and that sort of thing, and have that be part of the mechanical, the equation in the mechanical operation.
Yeah, that would be probably the best scenario when we have the real-time data and the building can dynamically respond to any changes. However, at least in a design stage, if we could have a better understanding of the context where building is, that would already be a big step forward.
So one of the things that we're seeing is the role of current green labeling schemes, and particularly on buildings and things of that nature. So, Dushan, could you give us a little bit of background on how these current schemes have evolved?
Sure. So, yeah, generally when we talk about green building schemes, we have plenty of them around the globe, but they usually have the common goal or objective. So they want to make people healthy and comfortable and productive without compromising ecological integrity of the planet. So this is, if you look into definition of all these different rating systems, they will explicitly say that. Now, in practice, of course, some of them are more successful in achieving that goal, some of them less. But what is very interesting to look into historical evolution and to recognize that these green building certification systems have had a strong evolutionary nature. So first of all, they emerged in 1970s as a response to the global energy crisis, where there was a singular focus on energy performance, and that was often linked to negative effects on humans, sick building syndrome symptoms, and other illnesses. So that kind of propelled emergence of these green building systems. And then there was a period in 1990s where we kind of focused just on some very major hazards like tobacco smoke, asbestos, radon, and major health threats, which was then followed with a really focus on climate change in 2000s. And then only in the last maybe 10 years or so, we sort of entered the period of the notion that buildings should go beyond the do not harm approach. And instead of that, we should try to improve performance and comfort and health of people by maximizing all the benefits. And this has resulted in emergence of some green rating systems, which are very much focused on humans. You might have heard of some of them. On the other hand, if we talk about effectiveness of these green labeling systems, we can observe effectiveness in terms of the energy and effectiveness in terms of indoor environment. So if we look into the existing literature on the energy performance, we can see that, in fact, performance of individual green certified buildings vary a lot. So we can say that on average, green certified buildings, they do perform better compared to non-certified buildings, but there are many variability from case to case. And we also know that the higher certification level does not necessarily translate into higher energy performance. And it's in a way similar to indoor environmental quality. There is a bit of mixed evidence, but on average, green certified buildings tend to perform a little bit better compared to non-certified buildings. So, however, there is again an issue because they do not perform as well as we expect them to perform. If you imagine sort of a satisfaction scale from clearly dissatisfied to clearly satisfied, non-certified buildings will be around neutral level, and then green certified buildings will be towards satisfied, but still far away from the end of the scale. So the bottom line there is that on average, they have better performance, but they still, this level of improvement is, in my opinion, not sufficient yet.
One of the earlier incarnations of the rating scales, with the green rating scales, really were based more on commissioning, right? At the you get your green certification, but there was really no long-term monitoring of the building. and long-term performance, right? You meet your codes, you put in your bike racks, you do the things to make your your platinum standard. But in the end, right, that they ended up not performing that well. But some of the newer standards, like the WELL standards, are really looking more towards ongoing monitoring, correct?
Correct. The newer green building rating schemes are looking into this dynamic performance evaluation and recertification, continuous recertification, so to say. However, there are just a few programs that are doing this, and the problem is that it's completely voluntary. So you can do it if you want, if you wish. You get some maybe extra credits, but it is not really compulsory. Well, there is some obligation, like you have to do once in 3 or 5 years this commissioning of the system. But when it comes to this continuous performance re-evaluation, then that's quite voluntary still.
So, which brings us to the idea of indoor environmental or indoor air quality standards. There's been some talk about doing that in organizations such as ASHRAE, and also AIVC recently has been looking into that as well. What can you tell us about what's happening with regards to the standards that are coming out with regards to indoor environmental quality?
So I have been involved in leading this ESEAC SDC 34 activities related to developing an open database on indoor environmental quality guidelines, and it can be found under www.ieqguidelines.org. And there we currently have data from nearly 40 different countries, as well as international organizations. And we have started reviewing the data also. So there is some information available there. We are trying to collect and share it just to make it available for everyone. And yes, there is quite a variability you can see in these guidelines, national guidelines, and those also including those that are developed by professional organizations. And I think the reason for that, those differences, one of the reasons could be that we really don't have that many health-based guidelines available. And when they are available, for example, if WHO has given some health-based guidelines, it seems like also different countries are adopting those and using them. But then because of lack of research and other reasons, those type of health-based guidelines cannot be given, and there is still a need to give some kind of guidance or set up standards. Then it's kind of up to the organizations, individual organizations, what they are basing them on, and it's causing the variability there.
So we'll make sure that we include in the webcast the www address that you gave. How long has that particular committee been involved in that issue in ESEAC?
Well, I think we started working on this, collecting the information in 2017, 2018, but the committee itself, I think, officially launched in 2019. And since then, we have really developed this open database, and it's been taking a lot of work from a wonderful group of individuals, our committee members, and we just now are at the point where we have started looking at the data and hoping to review and find some interesting information about it. For example, right now there are certain pollutants that are timely in Europe during this energy crisis situation, and we have started looking at those and see what kind of guidelines there exist, for example, related to extreme temperatures, but also like CO, CO2, PM, radon, which all can be impacted if this energy crisis is going on. And it's just started in the last fall when we started getting a lot of questions about how low indoor temperatures can be set to save energy so that it's still safe and from the health perspective, or how high is the risk for dampness and mold when temperatures are reduced, and how much we can tweak ventilation to save energy. And these are the questions that we have been dealing with. And it's good to have guidelines available. Of course, they can't be applied if energy systems are destroyed or shut down, but in many cases, it's still useful to be able to rely on if not fully health-based guidelines, at least some standards that are based on critical evaluation of both health and environmental factors.
Yeah, I think it is important to have that. I think that, as you mentioned, there's quite a few countries that do have these guidelines, but I would imagine somebody like WHO or ISIAC with WHO working together would have a much more credible chance of setting some of those guidelines for, well, as you mentioned, thermal comfort, as well as CO2 and CO and PM 2.5. So I'm hoping that does come about, and that the various organizations do work together on this. You think that's going to happen, Ulla, at this point?
Well, it's hard to say, but I hope so. I mean, I'm sure there are reasons why there aren't, for example, health-based guidelines for certain things like ventilation, but I think it's the lack of research and what is causing that. It's not possible to set those type of numerical values, for example, but hopefully in the future there will be more effort.
There's a movement afoot just in the last couple weeks with ASHRAE and the White House in the United States coming together to talk about setting some guidelines or standards. Actually, this would be an ASHRAE standard is what they're looking at to talk about various indoor environmental qualities areas. So that should be an interesting process. And they're particularly interesting to me is they want it done in 6 months, which I think is virtually impossible. But it's certainly an interesting process to see, the upper echelons of the United States government to be so intimately involved with working with ASHRAE to set these standards. We'll see what happens with that.
And of course, when there is an organization as ASHRAE, when they set their standards, they are also followed in many countries and so on. So
yeah, they go into the building codes. I mean, for very, very many countries, including Canada, and in many areas of the United States. So if they're going to set a standard, it's going to be quite interesting to see how people react to it. It probably will be a difficult process, to say the least. I wanted to ask you, Deshawn, about this editorial that you wrote or were co-author on an editorial in Indoor Air, the publication from ISIAC entitled, "Why Has the COVID-19 Pandemic Generated Such Global Interest from the Engineering Community?" And maybe you can tell us what the COVID-19 pandemic influences, how it has influenced the trade-offs between energy use, climate change, and IEQ public health.
Yeah, well, I'm not an airborne infection risk expert, but I was lucky to get invited to this editorial together with Dr. Julian Tang and Professor Hugo Lee. So there was a special issue on indoor environment and COVID-19, and in this special issue, there were a few studies summarized on aerosol transmission of virus indoors. But what I can speak about is, generally speaking, COVID has definitely changed the way we think about human health in indoor spaces. And it's interesting that we, in a way, have a collision of these two different, in a way, opposing problems or forces. On one hand, we have climate change and energy crisis in many parts of the world. especially Europe. So there are a lot of efforts to reduce the energy use. But on the other hand, we have COVID-19 pandemic that focused the attention on the importance of good ventilation or air purification of indoor air to reduce the airborne transmission of SARS-CoV-2 and other airborne diseases. But yeah, we know that extensive ventilation leads to high energy use and costs. So we talk about the two kind of different problems, but they are certainly intertwined. So provision of healthy and safe spaces should certainly not compromise ecological integrity of the planet. Well, also like locally, and I think we need to think about buildings that are able to anticipate. So we need to think how future buildings will have capacity to anticipate likelihood of certain events and to prepare for them. And then, of course, we will always have some sort of trade-offs between energy and environment, but we need to try to minimize them. Again, going back to the hierarchy of approaches, and this is the way how we also minimize these trade-offs. But yeah, we also, once we cannot minimize them anymore, we need to know how to prioritize over these conflicting requirements. So this will be, I think, this is and it will be quite important.
Thank you. We're running up against our deadline for an hour, and you guys have done terrific in answering our questions. I'll give each one of you one last chance to perhaps convey something about energy and indoor air quality. We'll start with Ulla.
Well, yeah, I guess for me the most important thing is to do more research on these topics because there isn't really that much research data available on, for example, on these effects of improved energy efficiency and energy retrofits on occupants' health and well-being and long-term studies. These are complex questions to study also, but we need that kind of data to be able to then give recommendations and take this into account when making decisions and developing guidelines.
Thank you. Dusan, do you have some last thoughts?
Yeah, well, I agree with Ulla. We definitely don't know everything yet. But on the other hand, I do think that we probably know enough to be able to take actions. So now, if we talk about energy renovation of buildings, we already know enough that these actions must be accompanied with, actions not to compromise indoor environmental quality. I also think we need to work on the education part. It is very important, HVAC engineers are taught very little or nothing beyond how humans are impacted by thermal effects. So, we really need to look into that and really understand that it's not that better indoor environment doesn't necessarily mean worsening energy performance of the building. Also, I think we need to ask ourselves a question: what will be the cost of not certain things? Not only like what is the cost of investing in better ventilation, but actually what is the cost of not doing these upgrades on our building? So, and maybe finally, I think whole system thinking. It's quite important. We need the integration of design process, not to look at things very individualistic. So throughout the building life cycle, whole building systems, heating, ventilation, air conditioning, materials, finishes, paints, and so on and so forth. So yeah, this is probably the way to go, whole system thinking.
And I think that's paramount, right? You're looking at the whole system and looking at the life cycle, which in the United States, we really don't look at life cycle very well. It's all first cost. Everything's first cost. And it's silly, but anyway. We need that change.
Well, I want to thank both our guests today for talking about these very important topics, and I think that there will be ongoing discussions going forward on this. But I really appreciate you spending your time to talk about some of the research that you're doing and how it will affect practice going forward. So, back to you, Bob.
So yeah, I guess we've come up on the hour again, which it goes fast, doesn't it? Always does. One thing I'd like to wish everyone a happy holiday season, and of course a very healthy and prosperous New Year. We'll be back again in January. We don't have a date yet, do we? We're
No, not
working
yet.
on that.
Sorry.
But
Yeah, we're
we're
working on
we're
it.
here every month, so we'll be back sometime toward the latter part of January. You'll see us again. We'll be a year older. No, not really.
Not quite. Not
No.
quite.
Not at all. So again, wanted to remind everyone that this program is a joint collaboration between ISIAC and IAQGA. We produce with Healthy Indoors. And again, thank you so very much for watching. And we will see you all again the next time we do the Indoor Environment Show sometime in January. Thank you.
So